Happy Friday afternoon, everybody. We're here today for an MSP Cyber Roundtable with Cam from AlertOps. I've been fortunate enough to, at every conference that I've been at, get to rub elbows with Cam. He's even bigger in person. He's a big personality too. So I'm excited to, get to have you here today. How are your guys' weeks?
Oh, great. Just at the Right of Boom conference in Vegas right now. So wrapping up today. But yeah, it's been a great show. I think definitely very educational from a cybersecurity perspective for sure. But first time at this conference, but it's been good so far.
Give me some of the highlights if you want. You don't have to. If you're...
So, I mean, realistically, you know how the shows go, right? You're talking to so many people that everyone starts to come into this one amalgamous singular face. But with that said, I think one of the things that I'm really excited about is the integration partnerships that we kind of have started, like building a few relationships with some vendors in this space. So within the next quarter or two, I think that AlertOps is definitely going to come out with some pretty nifty cybersecurity features.
Very cool. Well, before we dive into our topic of the day, which is going to be lowering incident costs with best practice in incident management, which everybody knows Matt and I love talking about lowering costs and efficiency. And I imagine at AlertOps, you guys have some pretty good recommendations or positions as far as managing incidents are concerned. So, or at least dealing with elements of that. So we're excited about the conversation. Before we dive in, I'd love if you could tell everybody a little bit about your background. You were saying before our call that you just had your 5th year anniversary with AlertOps, which I think is cool, and I'm going to ask you a couple more questions about. But tell us a little bit about you.
Absolutely. So I've pretty much been in kind of the IT space for around 5 years. So coming up on 5 years, almost there with AlertOps here. And it's been awesome, man. I think we've really focused on the channel for about 2.5 years, and it's a pretty tight-knit ecosystem, right? So it's nice to know that whether you're a vendor or a service provider, that there is a large population of the community that's willing to help you find your footing and go forward. So it's been great.
That's awesome. I was thinking about job hopping earlier this week in relation to one of my friends that was hiring, and she was complaining to me that every application she's getting, it seems like they're enrolled for like a year. So you're one of those people who've done it the other way, which I mean, I'm in new space now. I intend to be here for a very long time. My time in Domino's, I was there for nearly 6 years. So I agree with and admire the strategy to a degree, but is that something you've done intentionally, or do you just love working at AlertOps? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I know that I love startups, right? I love everything from funding rounds to what is on the bleeding edge of technology. What am I going to be using tomorrow, or what is now a need? But beyond that, I think it's really the team, right? I know that you've met Eric, Chella, our CEO, great people to work with.
Down to earth guys too.
Yeah, so I think that's the biggest reason I'm still with AlertOps.
I love that. What's your favorite topping on pizza, or do you like pizza?
Yeah, I like pizza, jalapenos, and I'm very averse to pineapples on pizza.
Okay.
He's on the anti-pineapple.
Very fair. Man. I respect that. Matt, do you have any? Go ahead.
I love jalapenos on pizza.
Yeah. Well, you have. I imagine your wife's from south of the border, and that's a big. At least in my time in Florida, it was one of the most common toppings on pizza. It's a big.
She came from an island in the Caribbean, and apparently they don't have hot peppers there. Is that weird, man?
Oh.
I don't know. I mean, I'm learning new things about agriculture every day. Forgive my ignorance. Matt, do you have any?
I didn't know either.
Yeah, I mean, it's cool. Matt, do you have any questions for Cam about Cam before we dive into all the security fun?
Oh yeah. Well, where are you headed next, man? So you just finished Right of Boom. Where are you going?
So get to go home for a couple of weeks. Going to be hanging out in Chicago, and then there.
When do you get home?
I will get home tomorrow morning.
Okay, so we'll be in Chicago, and I probably should have been saying this for the past million weeks, but and forgive me for just getting distracted from you for just a moment. But, Matt's up for an award in Chicago this week. He's a finalist for
Cyber leadership.
cyber leadership impact on the ecosystem, which is a really cool thing. And I know everybody on our team's pulling for him and excited to see how that shakes out. But we're going to be there in Chicago. So and one of my best friends lives about an hour or two, or maybe it's just an hour west. So I'll shoot you a message on LinkedIn and maybe we grab a beer. But I'm glad that you're going to get to be home and doing some fun things for you.
Also, I heard a rumor that Chris Johnson's buying anyone who shows up lunch if they show up next week at CompTIA CCF. So
there you go. There you go. Awesome. Shall we jump into lecture, my friends?
Yeah, let's do it. Here we go.
All right. Cool.
So we're talking FedRAMP today. I'm not going to go into the super nitty gritty, but I think there's a lot of confusion in the industry about what is FedRAMP. I think
what does it even stand for? It's not federal ramp like
it is literally like a word fusion from some marketing like work group.
God, not a work.
The idea was, the backstory here is it used to be to work with the federal government in technology, right? If you were delivering an IT system that the federal government depended on, that it had to operate under a federal authority to operate. People usually say ATO. And the way this works is a federal agency puts a stamp on a computer system and says, that's like a agency computer system and we can lean on it, right? And the way it used to work is each federal agency had their own process for issuing these ATOs, right? And when you had an ATO, that meant that your system could have federal government data in it. But then the cloud happened, right? One of the things that happened in the world of subscription software and outsourced technology services is that not all the IT stuff's in the federal building anymore. You know, as a subcontractor, you used to be able to operate under other people's ATOs. Like if you didn't have your own authority to operate, if you didn't have your own, you could just go deliver your server or like whatever your thing is to the right room in the federal government and plug it into the network, and like whoever operated the system there would just like put it under their ATO. But now we're in like this connected cloud world where data's flying all over the place and software just lives up there someplace, right? And the federal government wanted to be able to buy all those things. They were up there someplace. And so they came up with this idea, FedRAMP. The idea was to create an on-ramp into the normal method of approving systems for federal access. Now, bit of a mixed bag.
I don't love this one so far.
Well, you know, when the government comes up with a plan, more bureaucracy.
You said it.
So it did accomplish one thing, which is that it used to be that each federal agency had a different system for obtaining ATOs, authority to operate. And in addition to that, if you worked with more than one federal agency, you had to collect multiples of these like buttons on your lapel. And that's crazy that you have to go through the process multiple times. And so one thing FedRAMP has achieved is normalizing that. Now you have to go. You can still go the old way, right? But if you go through the FedRAMP way and you get approved through the FedRAMP process, you have this authority to operate that can be used in any agency or cross agencies in the federal government. Now, most people don't need to worry about this stuff, but because FedRAMP exists, people hear about it. Now, there are 200,000 federal contractors or subcontractors out there for the U.S. 200,000. A lot of small businesses.
I have a dumb question.
Yeah.
I have one I'm like excited about. Can a service provider outside the U.S. work with the U.S. government?
It depends.
Yeah, see,
I'm gonna keep
of
it simple. It
course. Yeah,
depends.
that's probably yeah. Okay, fair enough.
There are what are called ITAR requirements. If
Will you give me
anything,
that acronym as well? Sorry.
it's arms trafficking regulations. Okay,
Oh God. Okay. Great.
international arms trafficking
Not the arms.
regulations. And so the thing about ITAR requirements is that if you build something that's in the supply chain of the U.S. military machine, the defense machine,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's everything from paper clips to spoons to like apples to bullets and bombs, right? If you're backing that system, right, there's some protections to make sure that those systems, that supply chain, are secure from outside influence and outside control, but also particularly with sensitive data that only U.S. persons have access to it. So the answer is it depends, but in most cases, those constraints aren't nearly as onerous as people think they are. Um, so I don't want to get dragged into ITAR stuff. We'll do that another day. But 200,000 contractors and subcontractors out there. Before I go into the details of FedRAMP, let me put this in context. Of those 200,000, only 328 have been FedRAMP authorized. Okay? So that's way less than 1%. So a lot of people talk about FedRAMP and they think they need FedRAMP. The reality is almost no one gets there. However, as a buyer of cloud services, if you want to sell something to the federal government, you can host in Amazon or you can host in Azure, and they have a FedRAMP stamp that covers their systems. Now, that does not automatically extend to your systems because FedRAMP goes way beyond just what data center is the data in. It's who has access to it, how is it managed, etc. However, you can say to a federal buyer, your data is hosted in a FedRAMP facility. We leverage Azure's FedRAMP facility. We leverage Amazon's FedRAMP facility. In addition to that, there's a lot of miscommunication or misunderstanding in the world that you need to be in the government version of Amazon or the government version of Azure to get FedRAMP, and that's just not true. There's different levels of FedRAMP, and I'll get into that now. There's low impact, SaaS, and then there's low impact, moderate impact, and high impact baselines. So originally there was just low, medium, high, and the idea was that those map more or less to the low, medium, high standards, standard baselines set in NIST 853. So if you look at the NIST 853 security standard, which is both for the government but also for private sector, you'll see baselines low, medium, and high. And the idea is that those map to information risks that the federal government designate low, medium, or high. They will look at their unclassified information and their classified information, and they will say this is a high risk, this is a low risk, this is a medium risk. And so when you get an authority to operate, it's not just authority to operate with federal systems or data. It's also authority to hold data at a certain impact level. Now, FedRAMP is impossibly difficult for most organizations, and it takes a long time. Remember, there's only 328 out of the 200,000 vendors out there that are authorized.
Oh God.
So
Is
because
it
of
that challenging?
it's that challenging. So because it's so
I guess
challenging, FedRAMP more recently came out with the idea of low impact SaaS because federal buyers were like fed up. They were like, we want access to all this SaaS in the world, and these SaaS vendors just don't care about FedRAMP. So let's make an easy version of FedRAMP. As far as I understand it, there's not many vendors that have actually gone through that low impact SaaS
Is that
roadmap.
going to affect security of the bombs? Because that doesn't
Uh,
sound like I
I'll tell you
almost want to tell them to deal with it.
The biggest difficulty here is that because it's so difficult to get FedRAMP ATOs,
Yeah.
the government doesn't get to take advantage of the best software that's out there, the best systems, the newest stuff.
Yeah.
And that was not always the case. The federal government used to have cutting edge IT, and this is sometimes no longer the case.
I kind of feel like, and you're not asking, but here I go anyway. I kind of feel like at a certain point, you pay for security. You either pay for it in cost, and in this situation, it seems like you're paying for it in efficiency. And as a citizen, and as considering the types of things that are needing to be protected there, I'm okay if they don't run efficient businesses and they keep that safe. I don't know if that's like ignorant or a silly way to think.
Well, my personal opinion is I think that there's a lot of room for nuance in how secure should the government be.
I respect that. That's fair. It's very fair.
Just real quick before we move on, I think we're all FedRAMPed out. The reason why it's so hard to get, this isn't just you need to have a bunch of security in place, because that would be hard enough. But first you have to build the castle. The castle has to be, walls that are 20 feet high, whatever, etc., 3 feet thick. And that may take you a year or 2 or 3 and hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to build. And it could take you, if you're already at a high security level, it may only take you 3, 6 months, 12 months to prepare. But oftentimes this takes longer for organizations to build a literal castle. After that, you raise your hand. Someone comes in and investigates you and says, yes, you are indeed ready for the FedRAMP process. They check your homework and they're like, they send you back to do it again if they don't even think you're ready to start the process. But then you start the process, and end to end here, it's a year or two. You have to go through readiness assessments. You have to go through a full assessment after that. You get your authorization, and then you have to go through a review process with JAB, and that can again. So this is the joint. I want to say, I forget what the A stands for. It's a joint security board for oversight on these federal security systems. In any case, you have to go
Mike
through an
Tyson
oversight.
is big on this one, right? Didn't he talk
The
about a
JAB process.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you got to go through that process even after you've done the whole audit, and it's been graded by assessors. It then needs to get investigated by another board, and then of course you have to keep going through the process continuously. And this is the reason why out of 200,000 contractors, only a couple hundred have been through it. And if we rewound a couple of years ago, it wasn't even a couple hundred; it was like 50 a few years ago. So it is accelerating, but accelerating is relative, and most of you watching are nowhere near FedRAMP ready, and you never will be. However, you can take advantage of those Amazon or Azure clouds, and as I mentioned earlier, if you missed it, the regular Amazon cloud is FedRAMP moderate. The regular Azure cloud actually can be moderate or high. You do not need those government clouds, those government-specific clouds that cost more, unless the government contract specifically says so.
Cost savings with Uncle Matt. There you go.
All right. I've had enough FedRAMP for the month.
I got one last FedRAMP question. Is that the hardest one? I guess it's not really a FedRAMP question.
The hardest security one, or what?
Yeah, like this framework, or I mean, again, it was either last week or the week before. You threw out framework, standard, and then like 6 other words, and I
would say
it's
it's the most expensive. Let's put it that way.
I guess that makes sense. Yeah, that's probably why there's so few of them. Okay, cool. Well, thank you for that lecture. Cam, any of that exciting to you?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Okay. I won't pretend like I know a thing about FedRAMP. So that was very, very informative. And awesome. I definitely appreciate that.
Very fair. I was in the same boat too. Not anymore now, man. But I think talking about lowering incident costs, excuse me, is definitely more in your wheelhouse. So let's open things up. I think a great place to start, at least for me, when opening up the thought project of how am I going to lower incident costs, the first thing that I want to do is say, well, what cost related to the whole deal falls under the category of because of the incident, right? Because there's the cost that I lose from the business operations, but then there's the cost of my people that are doing some things that are related to it, some things that are related to just they're getting coffee, like right. There's all sorts of different things. So I would love to hear your expert opinion on that. And Matt, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that a lot of the times when talking about incident cost, it's very heavily segmented to two categories, right? People often talk about, like you said, from an operational perspective, what is the monetary value that I have lost as a byproduct of this incident, or as a byproduct of this outage, as well as long-term operational and reputational damage, right? So from a business perspective, is my client going to leave me because of the way that this was handled or the duration of the incident? So those are normally the two that people look at, and they normally consist of the largest chunk of what it's going to cost. Right. But then from the other two that I'd say are fairly important are manpower. Right. So like you'd mentioned, what staff is actually part of my incident response plan? Right. Who needs to be notified at what point and how much time are they going to spend in terms of detection, in terms of containment, recovery? Right. And then beyond that, tools as well, right? What softwares, what do I have? What maybe even piece of hardware do I need to physically or remediate and triage this incident to an effective capacity?
Matt, do you want to throw some things in there? I've got a follow-up
I know
question
that
on
I think it's along the same lines, really. I mean, I look at this from two different perspectives. I look at this from the customer's perspective. An incident that's not managed effectively can lead to humongous loss for that end client, right? Could also lead to a loss for the service provider if they lose that client.
Yeah.
But I also look at this like chain around service providers' necks. If they don't effectively implement high quality incident management, when those incidents happen, even if the customer at the end of the day says phew or like, hey, you handled that great, that may be the customer's point of view, right? And you just talked about manpower. If the service provider is treating every incident like a fire instead of business as usual, man, does that get expensive for the service provider, right? Everyone's going to drop what they were doing, right? Go deal with the incident. What happens to the switching cost of like, there's this other thing that was supposed to be happening, right? So I think organizations that I've seen
the opportunity cost of having to go
totally
with something else. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I love that.
It's true. And organizations that have more mature incident management practices, they don't feel like fires. They feel like business as usual. They have a plan, and if their processes are high maturity, guess what? One of those processes is, how do we do this better next time? How do we do this better next time? How do we prevent this from happening to begin with? And when all of that stuff's happening, the service provider is going to lower their costs, and their whole business is more profitable. It's not just about the incident management as its own service that creates revenue. It's about overall IT ops being more effective and lower cost.
I love that. I love that. That was freaking. You're over there playing jazz.
And I think too, right, kind of along the lines of what you were hitting on there, Matt, is like you said, it depends on the maturity, right? And the reason that people start thinking it's a fire that they have to put out rather than business as usual is because an incident response plan that an organization spent a few hours with their team building out sits there and collects dust in the bottom shelf of some office drawer, and it hasn't been touched or reviewed on a quarterly basis, right? So all of a sudden, you are not familiar with what needs to be done throughout the course of an incident. And that's kind of why panic mode starts to set in. So I think regularly revisiting your response plan, not just post-incident for a post-mortem, but also on a quarterly basis, just to make sure that you're covering your bases there, right? And then all of a sudden, when something does pop up, that incident doesn't seem like this building is crumbling in front of me.
I love all those points. I have one question. You mentioned cost related to tools. When do you count the cost related to tools as related to specifically an incident? Are you measuring, tools that are associated to the handling of incidents on whole? Are you considering them outside of that? I'd probably love Matt's opinion on the question as well. Just like from the MSP's perspective, how do you allocate those costs in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. And kind
Or
of
on your
from my
P&L, maybe is a
perspective.
better.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So from my perspective, right, and I guess the major way that I look at it is it's operating overhead, right? You know exactly what you need in the case an incident does happen. So at least from what I would think is that the cost of an incident isn't really attributed to the tools themselves. The tools are a mitigation measure, right? That you essentially just eat the cost of, because the second that an incident does happen, all of a sudden the financial detriment that you could be under is significantly higher if you don't have the right tools.
Right. Matt, you want to throw anything at me on that?
Well, I think all the
You've been in the
IT
MSP
tools.
space, so how did you cook, or cook is maybe the wrong word because it
No,
implies negative, but how did you put the
I
P&Ls together?
I don't think that there's such thing as incident tools and non-incident tools. I think that yes, there are tools that you need because incidents happen. That's true. But I think when an incident happens, you need to bring all of your tools to bear. Um, and oftentimes it's
Yeah.
the same tools you were using yesterday during not an incident, right?
Yeah.
And I think that those incident focused tools, they add a lot of value to not an incident as well. Or another way of looking at this is, what is an incident? Because I think people tend to think of the B word when they're
Yeah.
not in the security world, the
I
breach
started
word that
off
we
that
we
way
try
on
not to
accident.
say.
I mean, at the 250 mark, it was completely in my
Yeah.
head. The incidents that I was imagining were
So
that
us
way.
security guys, we try not to use the B word because the idea of a breach is that it wasn't managed effectively. Your organization didn't do the right thing. They did something wrong. But if you're managing your incidents effectively, you don't do anything wrong. And the reality is you're gonna have incidents. And you may not be labeling them that way, right? But everything from an account lockout to like I lost my device to, hey, I clicked on a link and I don't know if it's a problem or not,
I
right?
think I think I've heard either you say or I've read that even instances of, like, depending on situationally, instances of incorrect passwords. Um,
It can be. It can
right.
be. It's the service provider's job to define what's an incident and what's not. And I think people have this tendency they're afraid of incidents. And so they set that threshold arbitrarily high, which almost guarantees that they don't know how to use their muscles when they need them. I'm of the opinion that you should lower that threshold to the point of operation norms so that incidents do come up on a regular basis and that you bring your team into action on a regular basis. And so, I mean, that's one of the ways of um, making an incident business normal is it literally is business normal, right?
Yeah,
So
I love that. I mean, we talk a lot on this uh, webinar series about identifying and then using what you've identified to improve. So if you're not identifying anything as an incident, you're not going to get very good at the plan to make that situation better or solve it. I think that's a really great point. Cam, so you work a lot with you guys have been in the channel for about 2.5, 3 years. You said, or 2.5 years. So you've been doing a lot of engaging with MSPs, having conversations about uh, incidents and handling them properly. What are things that get in the MSP's way or slow them down on handling just this whole space
Mhm.
effectively? What are those challenges?
So I think, like I had previously mentioned, right, making sure that you're actively and consistently revisiting your actual incident response plan, right? That's one, because I know that there's a lot of talk about it, and I know that there's a lot of awareness that it's important, but now operationalizing it, making sure that we have a quarterly meeting set up to actually review it. But then beyond that too, throughout the course of an incident, right, especially during that identification step, what do you classify as an incident and associated impacts as a byproduct, right? So I know that with RMMs, SIMs, or your PSA, the amount of noise that exists across an MSP's tech stack is humongous, right? And because of that paranoia, right? Maybe you want to know if CPU usage is above 35%, but realistically, throughout the course of an incident, that's going to hinder you in terms of associating all of the corresponding service tickets that rose as a byproduct of a singular incident, right? So I think that eliminating noise during an incident is definitely critical for that identification piece.
You just said something so important. I want to go back to it. Can you go back to, you alluded to that there's a difference between the threshold of when you decide something's an incident, and that's different from deciding what the impact is, or is there any impact?
Mhm.
And I think people are afraid of incidents because they don't want to tell other people. They don't want to notify other people, right? And it all comes down to impact, not incident or not, right? It's impact or not. So can we go back to that? Like,
Yeah.
zoom in there.
No, absolutely, right. And I think that there's a lot of paranoia that exists around like that threshold that we're talking about. And I think that it's fair to say that that threshold can vary from service provider to service provider based on one, the clientele, but two, their own risk tolerance. But then beyond that, being able to say that on a day-to-day basis, I want to know if this threshold is ever breached is a lot different than actually identifying when the incident response plan needs to be dusted off, right? And I think that it goes back to like what you had previously mentioned, Matt. What is an incident? And I think that can vary from organization to organization depending on the nature of their business. But being able to define the scope of what an incident is, as well as how you classify something as a normal service request versus an incident, and being able to determine based on the business impact what that difference is, right? Maybe you are justifying what your threshold for an incident is based on the potential revenue loss, right? Or what you would gain as a byproduct of resolving the incident. But whatever that is, I think that that's definitely something that MSP should take the time and try and define, right?
I love that. We talk in the startup world. You really have to be thoughtful about where you're aiming your attention because you have limited attention. You've got limited folks to work on things. So you got to be right at where you shoot your arrows. You don't have to hit it perfect, but you got to shoot them in the right direction, or at least have something defined. So we talk all the time about like what are we focused on, what do we want to do. I think if you never define the goal, you're never going to hit the goal. So I love every time I hear somebody say that, that just hypes me up. I love that. We've got a question in the chat. That's a good one that we should get to. Let's jump to that. Matt, take us through this one. Oh, I love Richard.
Well, so I mean, I want to go back to something that was just said. You just said, Cam, you talked about deciding what is an incident and what's not an incident, and also maybe like how do you categorize? And I think that you're right. Looking at impact, like what is the impact, is a great way to categorize. It's not the only way. And there's different types of impact. There's impact to the end customer, right? But then there may be the steps that you as a service provider have to take based on whatever that situation is, which is not necessarily the same thing as business impact, right? And that also might be involved. And I think Richard's asking about times for each step in the process. And I would say, well, this really depends on what type of incident, right? But also, look, the best way to measure this stuff is to practice it and then just take out your stopwatch and be like, oh, that took 6 hours. That took, 6 days. And you're clearly not going to rehearse every type of incident that could happen, right? But you can take a lot of questions off the table and you can guess at the rest.
I like that. No, you said you can take a lot of questions. I'm going to dig in just a tiny bit to that because I love the point that you made, and I don't think that it was inherently obvious. You can take a lot of questions off the table, and what I believe you mean, or at least what it means to me, is you can identify what the common shit that is always happening is, and then you can solve for that. So anything that falls outside, maybe you choose the first standard deviation on the bell curve. Maybe you say, hey, we want to get all the way out to 95% or 98%. But wherever you set that, solve for the most shit, and then go from there. And that's Matt's point, and I love that point. I'm a big believer in do what's going to have the most value. Go ahead.
And there's an inferred question here that Richard didn't ask, but I'll bet other people are asking, which is steps.
Yeah, that's a good place to go from here.
So
I like that.
Do you want to take a stab at that, Cam?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that the steps of an incident, like you said, once again, depends on the nature of the incident, but the high level categories are always going to be the same, right? Your prep. I recommend doing it on a quarterly basis, making sure that you have your response plans outlined. But then after that, right? That's kind of
with all leaders. Don't. If I hear any security guy come to me, or any leader of an MSP that's focused on putting these plans together, come to me and said, "Well, I sat down and I made the plan," and they didn't tell me that they didn't talk about it with anybody, you're gonna have steam blown out of the sides of my ears like a teapot. Keep going.
Yeah, no, absolutely, right. Effectively communicating it, right? Because it's not a one-man operation when there is an incident. But then from there, it's identification, right? And that's where your RMM, your SIM, your SOAR solutions start to come into play, right? The monitoring tools. And once again, that step is continuous. So as soon as there is a blip that's identified as a potential incident, being able to have the tools in place to detect that. And then from there, you obviously go to containment, right? How can I prevent risk of spreading this incident further? And then once it is in fact contained, it is eradication and then post-mortem, right? So how do we prevent any of the detrimental impact that this incident had on us, as well as from a post-mortem perspective, why did this happen? How do we prevent it from happening in the future? And what was the impact to the business as a byproduct of this? So I'd say those are the actual individual steps. Now, assigning a time frame to those is rough, right? And I think it's difficult because, once again, it's dependent on the type of incident. There's a lot of numbers that I can throw around.
What you're trying to protect against,
right? I'm sorry?
Forgive me for cutting you off, but also what you're trying to protect against.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Oh, there may be notification cycles. And to make that even more complicated, there's laws out there that say you have to notify people within N number of hours or days. Believe it or not, there's also laws out there that say, and this is really crazy, there's also laws out there in conflict with those laws that say you're not allowed to notify people for N number of hours or days, and they don't agree.
Yeah.
and so, I mean, some of those timelines are set for us, right?
And I think too, right, from a notification perspective, that's something that always gets me, right? The kind of contradicting laws that exist. Because what does everyone tell you? When an incident happens, immediately contact your lawyer, immediately contact your insurance. But then the question starts to come into play. Do I need to contact the media? Do I need to contact my end customer? And obviously, right, in accordance with all legal practices, my suggestion is transparency generally smooths over the impact of an incident and goes better with customers than trying to brush everything under the rug. So,
well, that's the difference between the incident word and the B word, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked a lot about the problem space. How do we freaking solve for it? How do we lower those costs?
I mean, I think that it's not rocket science, really, right? Having the right tool set is obviously critical. Ensuring, and there's a lot of great research out there, right? Even for specifically catering to service providers that allow you to identify gaps within your infrastructure, gaps within your existing tech stack. So that's a good place to start. And then once you've covered your basis there, making sure that the tools are actually configured correctly, right? Because having a SIM solution that isn't set up right isn't going to do you many favors as far as incident detection is concerned, right? So I think that your stack, as well as ensuring that your stack is effectively in place and implemented for you to resolve your incident. But then beyond that, like I'd mentioned, you should know your response plan well, right? You should know it at the back of your hand, and then practice, right? Tabletop exercises with the entire team involved throughout the course of an incident response process is critical. I'd say that on a quarterly basis, at least.
I'd love to interrupt and add to that little section that you just said. When you're doing tabletops as a business, if you're advanced enough to be doing it, and if you are, congratulations. If you're doing tabletops as a business, do the gambit. You know, do the simplest type of incident that you're labeling an incident, where you've set that bar. Do the most basic, do a uh-oh, and do an oh fuck, you know, and go through the whole scale, because it's important to be able to recognize the difference in the experience. Because to Matt had a really good point of, you know, where you set that tolerance, everything below it is unused muscle. So you may feel like, well, this is what I do all the time, the easy one, so I'll just test that. Or this is what I'm most scared of, so I'll just test that. But the reality is, the feeling of the different things for your operators and for your executors and for your communicators and for your leaders, it's actually a different experience. So there's just a little thing that was longer than I intended it to be, but
no, 100%. And I think what you said was perfect. I think, Zach, you were there during a panel discussion that we had with ConnectWise back in November, right? Yeah. And it was great because the panel kind of broke down, right? It was not formal at all. And if we just went through various incident scenarios, right? As well as how you would handle each one and what the steps of response are. So it doesn't even need to be that comprehensive. I think we had like 17 different scenarios. If you can go through 5 of them on a quarterly basis, that still keeps you fairly fresh as far as what your response process is going to be for different types of incidents.
Exactly. Matt, do you want to throw anything in there?
Well, it sounds like someone should be in charge of this.
Who should be in charge of this?
So let me just like go back up a little bit. You know, so having the tools, it's really prerequisite, right, to have an effective, well integrated, properly configured tool chain, right? That's essential. It's requirement. But you also have to know how to use them. You have to practice them. You have to get good at them. Like I enjoy carpentry, right? But I'm not great at it. I can take my time and like put together a thing, right? But I don't practice enough, right? Yeah. And I think that there are people behind all these processes and tools, right? They need to try them out. And in addition to that, someone needs to make sure everyone shows up to the pizza party that is the tabletop exercise, right? Someone needs to stick it on the calendar.
And a good way to do that, sorry for interrupting you for the sake of a joke, but a good way to make sure that everybody shows up to the pizza party that is the tabletop is to have pizza there.
Yep.
Sorry.
Right. But someone needs to be assigned that, right? So yeah. I think that I think most of the people listening understand that incident management is a team sport. And if you don't, let me just tell you, it's team sport. But you gotta have a coach. Someone needs to be the leader. They don't need to be the best at everything. They don't even need to know how to do everything, but they need to be in charge of the team, right? Every team needs a coach, and incident management's no different. It might be the CISO. It might be a designated like security account manager inside the service provider org. It could be someone at the client actually. And because you might be a co-managed shop, and you as the service provider might just be, you know, there might be 5 people on that incident team or 10 people, and you're just bringing a few players, you know?
You may have folks at clients that are running tabletops, and you may need to do your own, and you know, you may have to think about
absolutely.
Yeah. You may have a little tabletop inception going on. Keep going.
I feel informed, man. Should we talk about AlertOps, like a little more specifically, like you're working with service providers, and what's the specific way that you work with them?
Yeah, so we are a tool that service providers predominantly use to notify the right person at the right time. So we take signals from across your stack, your RMMs, your PSA, security tools, and find the signal in that noise that we were just talking about, right? And ensuring that when you have your process in place, making sure that those timelines actually are hit, right? That if you have an SLA prior to an SLA breach, that the right person is notified and escalating up the chain. So we essentially contextualize and operationalize visibility and notifications from across an MSP's tech stack.
Well, that sounds like one of those essential components, and I think um, it's really the biggest missing piece when you look at the tools that service providers already have in place, right? Your RMM tools, your PSA tools, ticketing tools, like, but they're not incident management tools, right? They just fire tickets, right? They create noise. So having a process requires clearly some machinery to make sure it operates effectively and repeatably.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, what should we do from here, Matt?
So I don't know. Do you have a favorite incident story you want to share?
Cool.
No names.
Yeah, I think I might need to get back to you on that one.
That's a smart response.
Yeah.
What do you see most common?
Mhm.
We could probably
Um,
go there. That's a no. That's a safer direction.
So I think most commonly, right? And once again, it's an incident depending on who you're asking, right? Because to the service provider, it might just be part of the service levels that they've agreed to. So it's not really considered an incident. But if the customer happens to be an e-commerce company, right? Having a shopping cart go down is definitely one that tends to get people very riled up. And I know that that's something that I've actually come across when POS systems fail or if e-commerce shopping carts fail, right? And that can be because of a number of reasons, right? Server offline or the latest deployment that they made to their website has crashed something. Whatever that looks like, I'd say that that's probably one that I see fairly commonly.
Let me triple down on that. You just made a point that it's familiar to me, but I'm realizing a lot of people don't realize. Yeah, we talked about, well, it depends. What an incident is depends, right? But from a theory perspective, what we're talking about is an emergent situation has occurred, right? Something happened, and it's caused an organization to leave their security tolerance space, right? So each organization, if they're operating a security program effectively, should decide how much do we care about confidentiality? Do we care about confidentiality? What's confidential? How much do we care about integrity? Like knowing that the data is accurate, knowing that the data has only been modified by people that are supposed to modify it, right? Knowing that the systems are up, right? Like, do you care if the systems are up? How much do you care? What does up mean,
Mhm.
right? And finally, we have human safety issues. Like, there are situations that can lead to human safety issues. Any of these things could be emergent. You can be secure one moment, right? You can have security, which means that your systems are operating to the security guidelines your organization has set, or the tolerances that organization has set, and then you've left that area because a thing happened. And it's not always some phishing link got clicked on. It could be a hard drive failure. It could be the e-commerce site is down.
Ooh,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
helpful now. So I got to be careful about how I say this because I don't want to tell too much about other organizations. I'm going to not say the name of an organization, um, but I will. Okay, I've worked at many, many different organizations in the restaurant space, and it actually is the same for all of them, if I'm being completely honest. So I guess I'm not saying anything that's too. Um, they said, you could define something as an incident depending on like what the hell you're looking for. So I'll give you a for instance. Um, there are systems that'll track data around like like if a person clocks in, for instance, and then moves the time that they clocked in, you may
Yeah.
not think of that as an incident in the moment. Um, but it's good to track that shit, because if somebody decides they all of a sudden want to start doing that habitually, regularly, and turn it into a little profit system for themselves, I mean, that's like a different type of incident than like,
Well,
Yeah.
well,
I mean, maybe it is cybercrime, honestly.
if your business is based on having accurate time systems, and someone was not supposed to be able to do that, and they were able to do that, that's it. That's an integrity violation.
Yeah.
It would be an incident, and this is why
And
having those conversations is
it's also just an incident, even if they are allowed to do that,
Mhm.
because it might be an incident that's valid. This happened. We checked it. No, it's okay. X person showed up then. They were there. But it's also like, well, it's an incident because it may not be, and we need to check it.
Oh yeah,
Um,
you need to understand the impact. And that's why setting the thresholds for declaring an incident are
right,
separate from figuring out what the impact is, because you have to investigate an incident before you know if there's impact.
right.
And I
Yeah.
think too there, right? It's what you guys touched on. I feel is very important, right? Declaring an incident, because we've got day-to-day run-of-the-mill service tickets, then we've got incidents, and then you kick it up a notch, and then we've got a major incident, right? So when we're talking about major incident, the game plan starts to differ a little bit, right? So per
Yeah,
ITIL's best practice, you can have anything up until a critical grade incident that can be detected by a monitoring tool and initiate a response process automatically. That's fine. But the
yeah,
second you bump it up from critical to major, that requires human intervention and some level of verifying, okay, has this breached the thresholds that I have set for my company? And I am reviewing it to say, yep, we got a problem, but now it's a major problem.
right.
So I mean, most of our partner network, and I'm not sure about yours, they're pretty typical service providers, and which means that most of their customers are small businesses. Um, and so a lot of those small businesses, they're not necessarily equipped to understand or participate in those threshold settings. So
I'll say it differently. They're overwhelmed already with data that they can't get
yeah,
to.
absolutely, absolutely. Like you could try to have that conversation, and they don't they don't have the prerequisite knowledge to even participate in that goal setting. So you'll have to set it for them, right? And you'll probably use a different best practice in a dentist's office versus a hospital versus a factory,
You may
right?
have to have a conversation.
Yeah, or at least recommend different things on those
Yeah.
basis, right? Um, but that's certainly consideration as well. And we haven't talked about the profit side of the equation. We're talking about reducing costs, but another way of looking at cost is it could either be a variable expense, right, or a set expense as part of a cost of doing business. And I think that there is another side of the equation, which is the revenue. And if you have a revenue model based around incidents, that has
Yeah.
some way of offsetting the cost. And you
Great
talked
point.
about it a few minutes ago, Kamalesh. You were talking about how just because the customer has an incident doesn't mean that the service provider has an incident, and that is super important to recognize that business normal for a service provider could be like a really bad day at an end client. And just because an end client has a really bad day doesn't mean it's your emergency. You set SLAs with your customer, right? This is available to you. This is available to you. It costs this much or that much, right?
And it's sad to think about it, but it is, like you said, a revenue opportunity for service providers, because it's a little disappointing that it needs to get to that point for the end customer to recognize, hey, I actually do need to increase my level of service with you guys, because I have gaps in A, B, and C in my organization and my infrastructure. But a lot of what I am seeing is, even with those proactive conversations, people are a lot more likely to be convinced when they actually experience the brunt of an incident initially.
Well, it's people react to what the change goes where the attention is, and when something rolls up and kicks you in the face, you respond to it. So, I mean, that's just human nature. Well, we're in the last 5 minutes here. Should we do a round of major takeaways and then give a little couple of pitches and then do a wave?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, not that this was surprising to me, but I'm just hearing agreement all around that the core of incident management is people doing a thing, and yeah, you need tools.
Yep.
So
Exactly.
that's people need tools. So that's my takeaway.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think that for me, probably the incident response conversation is always a fun one to have. But biggest takeaway from this, Matt, was I don't think that I will ever look to be FedRAMPed. uh,
I like that. I like that. That's really cool. So my biggest takeaway, it actually Matt rolled it out late, man. He threw a late game touchdown, and I love it. The idea of the best way to lower your incident cost or your costs around incident is to create a freaking revenue model around incidents. Like that's like it's like well, how do I get these hogs off my property? Well, you make a bacon stand. That sounds like a great way to do it. I love that, man. That's a great perspective.
Yeah, and
Turning
I'm not
problems
talking
into
about taking advantage of
opportunities.
the customer. Just
No, provide a service or having a revenue model, a way to make money on that's what we're all doing, right? The
yeah.
pe- we've been solving problems as a species forever, and there's value in solving problems, and the way that we exchange value is currency. So if you're an MSP that's uncomfortable with creating revenue models around things, and you feel like, well, I don't want to take advantage of well, don't, because you're doing something for them, and if you are doing things for them for free, then they maybe are taking advantage of you. So just hold that where it is. It's okay to bring money in. It's not dirty to make money. It's dirty to make money if you're not providing value. If you're doing that, then it's a little icky. But if you find a way to provide value and you lower your costs through doing that, then that's a hell of a way to make a business efficient. And I love that. So that's my takeaway for today. Cam, you want to give us like a straight up AlertOps pitch?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, like I'd mentioned, we're an incident response tool, right? We make sure that the right person gets the right alert at the right time. So, making sure across your tech stack, ingesting all the signals that you've set up based on this conversation, now we can actually, I think it makes a lot more sense for viewers to understand that there are these thresholds, right? And what AlertOps does is it automates notifications between your technology stack when you have identified a specific threshold to behave in a particular way. So we automate notifications, but we also provide a tool and that will allow you to document your incident response processes. So not only are you automating the notifications, but you have that recorded in a place that is actually outlining when this incident A happens versus incident B happens, what is my response procedure, and then automating them.
Very cool. Matt, you want to give everybody a Fort Mesa spin if they haven't heard it
Sure.
before?
I mean, our center of gravity is compliance, and that sounds boring, but really, we're all about using the language of compliance that, believe it or not, end customers they have 8 different types of compliance. They get compliance language. Using that language to sell more IT services, deliver effective security postures, and prove it.
Yeah.
And yeah, we also create compliance documentation. So
Go
that's our
documents.
pitch.
Awesome. All right. Well, we've found our way to the end of another MSP Cyber Roundtable. Cam, I really appreciate you joining us, and I look forward to the next time that we get to rub elbows. Hopefully, sometime this upcoming week. But
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you guys for having me on. I appreciate it.
awesome, man. All right, everybody. If you're joining us for the first time, make sure to check out our educational YouTube gallery. And if you haven't already, make sure to like us on LinkedIn. Thanks, everybody, and have a great weekend.